a banner across the middle. It'll be posted there, so it'll be obvious as to where it is so you can find it. There'll be a recording of this presentation along with the document. If you have questions during the presentation, if you would be kind enough to use the chat feature, that way, if you'll use the chat feature, type out your question, we'll have a written record of all the questions. We will then take those questions, we'll provide answers, and we'll post those also on the website so that everyone has the benefit of the answer. Also, if you have suggestions, things that you feel like we've omitted, things that we should consider, I'd love to hear from you. This has had a lot of eyes on it, but you can always use more. So again, we would welcome your input. Just use that chat feature and put those down, or you can always send an email if you prefer to go about that way. So again, we thank you for taking the time here on Monday, 5 o'clock to join us. As I stated, we came up with a set of minimum requirements for activities. Now these minimum requirements will be applicable whether it's phase 3, 4, or eventually phase 5. The government came out, we're in phase 1 now, which is the shelter at home. Phase 2 is very restrictive, very limited, and is not conducive to either practice or play. So Indiana Soccer is not sanctioning any activities under phase 2. But when we get to phase 3 is when we'll be able to open up and have activities. But I wanted to go through these minimum standards so that we can prepare as we roll out and get to the fields, that we'll have these pieces in place and that we can communicate these aspects to those who will be in attendance, whether they be players, parents, spectators, referees, or whomever. I think the first one is pretty self-explanatory here. Symptoms. We don't want anybody on the field that's sick, obviously. And so this addresses that issue. And so if anyone's sick, we need to have a way to manage that. With adults, it's pretty simple. That adult leaves the field. If you have a minor, then obviously you can't have that child leave the field without having somebody being responsible for that minor. So that would have to be addressed differently. But if somebody is sick, ill, let's be firm, but be courteous in asking them not to be on the field. Typically, high fives, handshakes, all those types of things occur. But for the time being, unfortunately, we're going to have to sacrifice those celebrations and those activities. So we need to make sure that the coaches make sure the kids don't behave in this way, make sure the other adults don't behave this way, whether adult play or kids are playing. We want the coaches to wear masks. They're the ones that are going to be projecting any type of virus if they have it. So if they have on a mask, they'll protect all their players. Now, the players can wear a mask. Parents may want their players to mask. An adult player may want to wear a mask. That's a personal choice. But as far as the coach, because they're the ones that are going to be talking and be most susceptible to spreading something, we want them to wear an approved face mask. Hand sanitizer, again, that kind of goes without being said. Every player should have hand sanitizer for his personal use. Pennies, training tops, things that we would typically share cannot be shared going forward. So we need to make sure that every player has his own training top. He needs to have 2 colors, or if you've got pennies, I would assign a penny to a player and make sure they wash those between uses and bring them back and use them for the next use. But we don't need to be, as we've always done in the past, just throw them in a pile, put them in the bag, take them home, and then redistribute them the next time kids go to play. Also, we want to make sure they're not using common water bottles. And you'll notice we've removed all kind of communal water coolers. We don't want kids congregating around a cooler, sharing cups and glasses and so forth. So they need to have their own water bottle, their own ball, and their own towel. And the reason for the ball is you can transfer a virus from person to person on a flat surface. And obviously the ball is flat enough surface that could actually transfer that virus. A typical practice that most coaches would have, you're going to have the kids pick up the cones, or you're going to have the kids pick up the flags. You're going to have your other players pick up a flag or goals. That should be handled by one person. So I would suggest that the coach handles all the cones, all the flags, and the goals, so that we don't unwantingly transfer virus through touch. The other thing is the social distancing is going to be a challenge. With adults, it's going to be easier. You got adult players. Uh, they'll understand that 6 foot distancing. As we get kids, it's going to be a little more challenging to make sure that they understand what that 6 foot distancing is. But one thing a coach can do is make sure you don't have players lining up in a line. You don't want them to congregate. So you can adjust your training session to eliminate some of those things. That way you can just be cognizant of the fact if kids start to just do it naturally, then you can kind of urge them not to do it. If you have a facility, and some of us are blessed enough to have the facilities, we need to make sure those things are disinfected. If we're going to use the facility, bathrooms and so forth, they need to be disinfected hourly. Now, that's a high hurdle. So my guess is most of us will just close facilities. If you're going to have a concession stand, same thing holds true. Don't have it such that they'll congregate. I know if you guys have been out and you've been to a retail environment like a Home Depot or a Lowe's or someplace, they're only allowed to have so many people in the building, and so people will line up outside. I would think our concession stands could do something similar to where you would actually have markers, have cones on the ground or something to kind of give some guidance as to social distancing. So you could have cones to where people will form a line and then have cones that would break it up every 6 feet so that people aren't on top of one another, just so that we can continue to practice the social distancing. I would prefer to say physical distancing, not social distancing. We also need to have signage throughout the facilities to make sure that we're reminding people constantly we're trying to maintain this physical distancing everywhere, not just in the parking lot, not just on the field, but everywhere on site. And then we need somebody that can kind of manage that on behalf of the club. So we need somebody that's walking around that is monitoring and making sure that we don't have people congregating and violating the social distancing requirement. All of these things that we're doing is to make sure that we stay compliant with the governor's request so that our member benefits follow all the activities, the main one being insurance. So we want to make sure that everything is a sanctioned activity so that we not only have our liability insurance in place, but player accidental insurance. If you want to see more information on the form you'll see here, we've got some information from the CDC on preventing getting sick and what these community mitigation strategies are. As we mentioned, the governor did provide a presentation about the five different stages. We're in stage 1, as I mentioned earlier. If you want to see that in more detail, you can see right here on the screen. You can go to that website, and you can see the notes that were written, or maybe he even used them when he was doing his presentation on Friday. As we look at the stages, I move to that. Stage 1 is what we are now, which obviously there's no soccer play. Stage 2 is too restrictive for us to consider any soccer activities. As we get to stage 3, which begins on May 24, that's where they start to relieve some of the restrictions we're under. That makes it somewhat conducive for us to go out and begin training. Now, why I say training, again, this is stage 3, so all those minimum requirements that we just talked about at the top of the document are applicable in stage 3 and in stage 4 and in stage 5. But the additional things that need to be considered, is we'll go through some of those, is a limit of 25 people gather together. So if we start training sessions and you've got 25 people on half a soccer field, you're going to have the distance that you're looking for. Keep in mind, there's not going to be any contest for a ball. So all players are going to either have their own ball and train, or they're got to be spread out and just be passing the ball around. So if I see Dennis on the screen here, if Dennis and I and George were training together, as long as we stay 6 or 8 feet apart, we can pass the ball back around. What we can't do is put the one ball out and the 3 of us try to compete for that particular ball, because we're going to violate our social distancing requirement. We need to make sure, again, that we have plenty of space for the players when we're playing, whether they're passing, whether they're dribbling, whatever the activity we're asking them to participate in. We just need to make sure they have plenty of room. As I mentioned earlier, you need to have your own ball. You don't want a kid picking up a ball after another kid's picked up the ball. And one of the things that we don't have on here is we need to discourage kids from spitting. A lot of kids, when they're working out, they'll want to spit. Well, that is absolutely something that would violate the social distancing in most cases, but it also violate a safe environment. So we need to be extremely, we need to extremely discourage that type of activity, especially if it's windy, guy spits, you got that spray that's going to travel. We need to make sure that we're not allowing players to do that. The same way with the ball. The guy sweating, they're going to pick up the ball. You'll see them, they'll rub the ball in their jersey or so forth if the ball is dirty and throw it in. Well, now if you happen to be infected, you're now going to have that all over the ball. So we need to make sure each kid has their own ball. As I mentioned, this phase 3 does not provide for a competitive activity. So it's recommended that if we're talking about the youth game, that if you're under 10 years old, we limit those training sessions to 45 minutes. If we go longer than that, we're going to lose the kids' attention span. And according to the staff, it just is going to make for a less than attractive training session. If they're 11 and older, we can go up to an hour, but let's not go up to an hour and a half, 2 hours, because these kids are not able to compete against each other for the ball. If you're going to use the use of the facility, just to make sure that we do maintain enough space, we're asking that you put 20 minutes between training sessions. So that way you're giving the players who just finished their training session about 10 minutes to wrap it up and get off the field, and the other ones to 10 minutes to get back on the field and get set up for the next training session. So we just eliminate that interchange where players would be on top of one another if one training was ended and one training began right afterwards. As we get to stage 4, again, the minimum standards that we talked about at the top of this document are still applicable here. And as always, it's going to be the club's responsibility to provide oversight for the social distancing protocols. I would just have someone who that's their job, just to walk around and make sure that we don't, because we're going to forget, especially for kids, we're going to forget. So we need somebody that would be firm but polite in making sure that we maintain our distances. As we look down here, the governor has continued to relieve some of the restrictions. And so now we can have actual competition. So now we can actually get out and play. We can have tournaments that can resume. Again, the social gathering is to 250 people. But as I look at our facilities around the state of Indiana, if we have pairs of fields, we have quads of fields, we most definitely have, or in most cases, we have room where we can put more than 250 people at a facility because we're going to spread them out over a number of different fields. Still, the social distancing aspect is still a requirement, so we want to make sure we're respectful of social distancing. Again, players need to bring their own towel, their own water. Let's not have communal water coolers where players will congregate around to get water. As we look at the sidelines, as we did in phase 3 and on phase 4, remove benches, because a bench is going to encourage kids to huddle around or adults to huddle on the same bench. So if we can remove the benches from the field, we can encourage players to bring their own chairs or they can just sit on the ground. But we need to mark off place where they can stay in their own, that we separate them by 6 foot. So I would urge clubs to go ahead and mark the fields as to the areas or little zones, 6 foot zones where kids can stay in the center of their zone. That way they're going to be 6 foot away from their teammates, just to maintain that social distancing. Some of the same things are true here about the training tops and so forth. We don't want to have communal training tops that we're trading back and forth. It's still a good idea to put 20 minutes between training sessions so that we don't have players and parents congregating or clashing when in between training sessions. And then when training session ends, the coach just needs to promptly thank the kid for being there, or thank his adult players for being there, and then promptly ask them to leave the field so to make room for the next group coming in. The other thing is if we have bleachers for spectators, again, we want to maintain social distancing. So if we do have permanent bleachers, we can either rope them off and sign them that people don't use them, or we need to make sure that there's signage that are encouraging those who are there watching the game using the bleacher to maintain that 6-foot distance. So we'll keep the social distancing aspect intact. And then we moved to stage 5. And basically stage 5, and what we're hearing from the governor's office, there could be some changes. So we didn't go into a lot of detail here, but it looks like right now, if all things go well and what they anticipate happening with this virus does it happen the way they anticipate, that they'll relieve even more of the restrictions. It appears though that the social distancing will still stay intact, but as that stage 5 gets closer and as we learn more, we'll be more than happy to fill this document with activities for stage 5. But there again, that is the presentation. We're anxious to get back out just like you all are. Within a few minutes of our goodbyes here, we'll post this document and the recording of this, but I don't know that we actually got it recorded. So maybe it should be the document. If you have questions, again, if you'd be kind enough to go ahead and use the chat box for those, we'll be reviewing those as we close out this session, and then we'll provide answers on the website. And there again, if you have other questions, you think about them afterwards, don't hesitate to send me an email. Mine's dave@soccerindiana.org. George is at george@soccerindiana.org. You've got Steve and or Angel. All of us will be more than happy to field your questions. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time this afternoon. Let's stay within these guidelines. We don't want to be the one that spikes this virus, and then we get a black eye over it. We also want to make sure we keep all of our players safe. So again, thank you guys very, very much.